On May 8, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. But the war did not end with that signature. What was left behind was a looted continent, a trail of thousands of tons of stolen gold, millions of missing works of art, classified technology buried under mountains, and weapons forgotten at the bottom of the sea. What followed was another war, that of the discoveries. During the 80 years that followed the defeat of the Third Reich, archaeologists, divers, researchers, and ordinary citizens were lifting up layers of hidden history. Each find brought back to the surface a fraction of what the Nazi regime had accumulated, hidden, or submerged in its flight. Panzers buried in German basements, collections of Reich artifacts behind shelves in Buenos Aires, the entire treasure of the Reichsbank 800 meters underground in a Thuringian salt mine. The Nazis did not only fight with weapons, they systematically stole Europe's cultural heritage, financed their war machine with gold from the central banks of the countries they invaded, and in the final months of the conflict dispersed their reserves in mines, alpine lakes, ships, and submarines. Some of those treasures appeared almost immediately, others took decades, and a part of them, according to the most recent files, has not yet been found. This is the account of the most shocking, most valuable, and strangest discoveries left by the Third Reich in its collapse. Aladdin's Cave under Thuringia, Murkers gold. On April 4, 1945, the village of Murkers, in the state of Thuringia, fell to the 3rd Battalion of the 358th Infantry Regiment of the 90th Division, part of Lieutenant General George Smith Patton's 3rd Army. It was a crossroads in the region of the Werra Basin, with no apparent strategic importance. But what lay beneath it was, at the time, probably the largest repository of concentrated wealth on the planet. It all started with a decision made 2 months earlier in Berlin. On February 3, 1945, 937 B-17 bombers of the US 8th Air Force dropped nearly 2,300 tons of bombs on the Reich capital. The Reichsbank's main building, in the financial heart of the city, was directly hit 21 times. The walls held, the vaults remained intact. But Walter Funk, president of the Reichsbank and Reich Minister of Economics, knew that they would not withstand another attack of equal magnitude, and that the Soviet advance from the east was already unstoppable. Funk made the decision on February 9th. Everything had to leave Berlin. The Reichsbank's entire reserves, gold, currency, banknotes, valuables, would be moved to an underground shelter in central Germany. The choice was the Kaiserode potassium mine, owned by Wintershall AG in the vicinity of Murkers. The mine had 50 kilometers of tunnels dug into the salt rock, with 5 separate entrances and a working depth of 800 meters. Its structure, almost indestructible for aviation at the time, made it the best shelter available. The transfer required 13 train cars. The convoy that departed on February 9th was carrying 1,000 sacks of Reichsmark notes, 250 tons of gold bullion and coins, and a fraction of the art collection that the regime had amassed over years of systematic looting. In the weeks that followed, more shipments arrived. Collections from 14 German museums, foreign currencies from multiple countries, and suitcases with jewelry and other objects confiscated from victims of the death camps. On April 4th and 5th, agents of the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, of the 90th Division began to hear rumors among displaced civilians in the area. None of them could confirm anything directly. Then on April 6th, 2 French women who had been forced laborers in the region were intercepted on a rural road. One of them was pregnant. The military police offered them transportation back to the village. As they passed in front of the Kaiserode mine, one of the women began to speak. He said there was gold in there. The Germans had taken it a few weeks ago. She knew this because she had worked unloading boxes. The information reached Lieutenant Colonel William A. Russell, Civil Affairs Officer of the 90th Division, that same day. Russell went to the mine, questioned more displaced people nearby, and obtained additional confirmations. The next day, he went down personally. The single-cable elevator took several minutes to take him to a depth of 640 meters. When the doors opened, Russell found Room 8, the original entrance of which had been reinforced with brick masonry. Inside, stacked knee-deep in rows that reached the back wall, were thousands of sealed and numbered sacks. Werner Weick, a cashier in the Reichsbank's foreign banknotes department, was among the officials who had traveled with the convoy. When questioned, he confirmed what Russell suspected. What was behind that door was the entirety of the Third Reich's gold reserves. The complete inventory of Room 8, recorded by SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, yielded figures that exceeded all expectations. 8,198 high-grade gold bars, 55 additional boxes of packed gold bars, hundreds of bags with gold and silver coins, 1,300 bags with German gold marks, gold pounds sterling and gold French francs, 711 bags of pieces of $20 in gold, 2,380 bags and 1,300 paper Reichsmark boxes, 20 bags of silver and 40 bags of silver bullion. The total value of gold was estimated at $250 million in 1945, equivalent to several billion in today's values. It was 93.17% of Germany's total reserves at the end of the war. But the gold was only part of what the mine hid. In other tunnels of the Kaiserode, soldiers found 400 tons of art. Paintings from 14 German museums, including works from the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin, books from the Goethe collection in Weimar, engravings from the Berlin print cabinet, illuminated manuscripts and tapestries. Among the paintings recovered was In the Winter Garden by Edouard Manet, and along with all that wealth, something that no soldier expected to see: suitcases and briefcases full of wedding rings, earrings, watches and gold teeth. The Reichsbank periodically received these remittances from the SS former civil servant Albert Toms would declare in writing in 1948 to the Nuremberg investigators. The bank had accepted these shipments from the death camps as actionable material within the state's reserves. On April 12th, Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar N. Bradley, George S. Patton and Manton S. Eddy descended in person into the mine. It was a top-secret inspection visit, impossible to leak to the press for security reasons. The single cable elevator that carried them was later described by Bradley in his memoirs as something none of them would forget. When they emerged from the cage and turned on the lanterns in Room 8, the silence lasted for several seconds. Eisenhower ordered everything to be photographed immediately. Patton, according to Bradley himself, said something about gold that General Bradley decided not to publish in its entirety. The urgency of extraction had a specific geopolitical reason. According to the Yalta Agreements, signed in February of that year by Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, the region of Thuringia was assigned to the future Soviet occupation zone. Once the Allied armies withdrew from the area, the Red Army would occupy the region. Anything that had not been extracted before that transfer would remain under Soviet control. SHAEF ordered immediate evacuation. The operation required 32 10-ton trucks and 11,750 boxes. Extraction began on April 14th and continued for several days under intense military guard. A full regiment was detached to guard the mine for the duration of the operation. Everything was transported to the Reichsbank building in Frankfurt, which became the Allied restitution depot for the Reich's financial assets. The artworks followed a different path. They passed into the custody of the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, and the most important paintings were sent to Washington, where the National Gallery exhibited them for almost 2 years before being returned to the Berlin Museum in 1950. The gold confiscated from Holocaust victims was the subject of a partial restitution process that spanned decades, with funds eventually channeled through international Jewish organizations and bilateral treaties between Germany and the State of Israel. But that was not the only reservation. The 6.83% of the gold that Funk had not sent to Murkers went to another destination, Bavaria and the Alps. Colonel Friedrich Josef Rauch, Hitler's chief of personal security, organized a convoy to the Karwendel Mountains in the final days of April. During the journey, at least 2 Reichsbank officials stole part of the funds for personal use. Emil Januszewski kept 2 gold bars. Another official retained 5 boxes of undeclared contents. How many similar cases occurred without anyone registering it is impossible to calculate. The rest of the convoy was hidden in the foothills of Mount Steinriegel. Rauch, cornered by the Americans of the T-Force, the Allied unit specialized in tracking Nazi assets, negotiated his own return in exchange for revealing the location. The gold was recovered. But the question that researchers haven't been able to quite close is how many similar, smaller, more scattered deposits still remain somewhere in the mountains of southern Germany and Austria, waiting for someone with the right maps to find them. The art buried under the Alps, Altos and the Fura museum that never existed. Adolf Hitler had a dream that he could never build. He had conceived it before the war, in the decades when he considered himself a frustrated artist, a museum in his hometown of Linz, Austria, which would be the largest in the world. The Fura Museum, a monumental building designed by Albert Speer that would include, in addition to exhibition halls, an opera house, a hotel, and a library. The collection that would fill it was entrusted to a team of art historians and painting experts who began to acquire and then confiscate works from all over the continent. That dream became the biggest cultural theft in history. The plundering began in 1938 with the absorption of Austria and Czechoslovakia. The works flowed from the museums of the occupied countries, from churches and monasteries, from private galleries acquired at derisory prices or directly expropriated from their Jewish owners. In the early years, Hitler stored part of the collection in his residences and in German museums. But as Allied bombing raids raged on the cities of the Reich, he began to seek safer shelters. The salt mine in Altos, about 70 kilometers southeast of Salzburg in the heart of the Austrian Alps, offered near-perfect conditions. Its 137 salt rock tunnels maintained a constant temperature of 8 degrees Celsius and a relative humidity of just 40%. At depths of up to 800 meters below the surface, no bomber could reach it. Emmerich Pochmüller, the mine manager, was ordered to prepare space in the autumn of 1943. I would need a lot. Between August 1943 and the first months of 1945, the Nazis moved to Altos the works accumulated under the code Sonderauftrag Linz, the Linz Special Commission. Hitler's collection for the Führer Museum traveled in more than 1,000 boxes, transported in 13 trucks from different parts of Europe. To these were added works from Austrian museums, churches, and private collections, and then from February 1944, approximately 4,700 works stolen from the rest of the occupied continent. In the end, the Altosi mine housed 6,577 paintings, 230 drawings and watercolors, 954 prints, 137 sculptures, and 129 pieces of historical weapons and armor. In addition, furniture, tapestries, coins, books, and dozens of boxes with unidentified contents. Among all this was Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, the marble statue stolen from the Church of Our Lady of Bruges in 1944, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, the altarpiece by the brothers Jan and Hubert van Eyck, stolen from St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent, paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Rubens, Bruegel, and Leonardo da Vinci, the jewels of the Rothschild family, and pieces of Italian art transferred from Monte Cassino for Hermann Göring's personal collection. In the spring of 1945, with the Third Reich crumbling, Hitler issued the so-called Nero Decree. Any infrastructure that could be useful to the enemy must be destroyed. August Eigruber, Gauleiter of Upper Austria and regional governor, decided that the decree also applied to works of art in Altos. On April 15th, without consulting anyone, he ordered 8 wooden boxes from the Allied bombing raids on Linz to be brought into the mine. Each box contained half a ton of explosives. To hide their contents, he marked them with a label, "Caution Marble, Do Not Hit." The miners of Altos discovered it. It wasn't difficult. The boxes were huge and heavy, and the men who had been working in these tunnels for years knew the smell of new wood and the weight of explosives. Most of them did not think about works of art. He thought of the mine, of the livelihood of their families for generations, of the tunnels their grandparents had dug, of the only job many of them knew. To destroy the mine would be to destroy the region. Emmerich Pochmüller tried to convince Eigruber. He failed. The alternative plan was devised by 2 men with radically different profiles. Hermann König, whose son was a defector from the Wehrmacht and was in hiding in the resistance, and Alois Raudaschel, affiliated with the Nazi Party. Politics was put aside. Raudaschel decided that the only person capable of stopping Eigruber was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Gestapo and second in command of the SS, who had taken refuge in the region at the end of the war. Contacting him implied an enormous risk, but Kaltenbrunner surprisingly agreed. In the early morning of May 3rd to 4th, 1945, a dozen miners removed the 8 explosive devices from the mine. The Wehrmacht soldiers guarding the entrances, exhausted and disoriented, surrendered their weapons without resistance and fled. When the commandos sent by Gruber arrived to detonate the explosives, they found the main entrances dynamited and blocked by the miners themselves. Gruber ordered Kaltenbrunner arrested. The confrontation between the two men was tense with shouts and threats, but the soldiers who were to execute the order preferred to desert before the imminent arrival of the Allies. On May 8, 1945, a U.S. infantry unit occupied Altos. Major Robert Posey and Corporal Lincoln Kirstein, both members of the United States Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, the so-called Monuments Men, had arrived days earlier, alerted by informants. On July 9th, art conservator George Stout personally supervised the start of the extraction. Military trucks began transporting the boxes to Allied collection points in Munich. The operation took weeks. In total, works that are now impossible to value economically were removed from the Altos mine. The restitution process began in 1945 and has not been concluded. Some paintings returned to their owners within a few years. Others took decades. Some of it is still the subject of legal disputes or remains unidentified in European museum deposits. The descendants of Alois Raudaschel, the man whose audacity saved the treasure, did not know for decades what he had done. The Amber Chamber, the mystery that is still unsolved. There are losses that seem definitive, and there are losses whose absence itself becomes a historical obsession. The Amber Room of Catherine's Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, 25 kilometers south of St. Petersburg, is both. The hall was built in the 18th century for Catherine's palace, in the years of the reign of Peter the Great. Its walls were covered with panels of Baltic amber of a dark orange color that varied with light, encrusted with gold, mirrors, and mosaics of semi-precious stones. The room measured approximately 55 square meters. The value of amber alone, according to the most conservative estimates of the 20th century, exceeded $142 million. It was, for those who knew it, one of the most extraordinary creations of European craftsmanship. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The workers of the Leningrad museums responded with remarkable speed. Within days, they began packing, hiding, and evacuating millions of objects from art galleries and imperial palaces to Siberia. But the Amber Room presented a unique problem. Its panels, fragile and adhered directly to the walls, could not be dismantled without the risk of irreversible destruction. The conservatives made the decision to cover them with wadding and paper. They hoped that the Germans did not know what was behind it. The Germans knew this perfectly. Nazi troops took Tsarskoye Selo in September 1941. They carried specific instructions. In a matter of days, SS specialists dismantled the amber panels with an efficiency that surprised even the Soviets who witnessed it. 36 boxes packed and ready for transport. The panels traveled to Königsberg, the former capital of East Prussia, present-day Russian Kaliningrad, where they were exhibited at Königsberg Castle under the supervision of the museum's director, Alfred Rode. The room was there for 3 years. In January 1945, the Red Army advanced on Königsberg. The battle was brutal. The city was devastated by Allied fighting and bombing. Alfred Rode died in December 1945, taking with him information about the final destination of the boxes. The Soviets, when they entered the city, did not find the panels. Königsberg Castle was partially burned. The boxes were gone. For decades, the search for the Amber Room was one of the most expensive and controversial projects in post-war archaeology. The most widely accepted hypothesis by historians, including those of the Russian State Institute of Art History, is that the panels were destroyed in the castle fire or in the final fighting for the city. But no fragment of burnt amber was found in sufficient proportions to confirm that conclusion. Other theories have led to expeditions in mines and tunnels under the city, in salt deposits in Saxony, at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. At the end of the 1990s, one such search produced an unexpected result. In Germany, during an attempt to sell it on the antiques market, original fragments of the room were confiscated, including an amber mosaic and an amber chest of drawers. The search revealed that they had been stolen by an SS officer as personal loot. In 2000, Germany returned those parts to Russia. In 2003, with the financial participation of German companies, a complete replica of the Amber Room, built with amber from the Kaliningrad region, was inaugurated in Tsarskoye Selo. The project took 24 years. The original, with a value that current experts estimate between $300 and $500 million, is still missing. The plunder to the east, the treasures stolen from the Soviet Union. The Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow was, and still is, the largest museum of Russian art in the world. At the beginning of the war, the museum team evacuated a huge part of its collection to Siberia, but not everything could be transported in time. More than 30 paintings of Tretyakov had been loaned for display at Soviet diplomatic missions in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. When the so-called Kunstschutzbataillone, the Nazi battalions for the protection of art, began their operations, these works were among the first to disappear. Soviet losses in cultural heritage during World War II are on a scale that is difficult to assimilate. More than 400 museums were damaged or completely destroyed. Libraries lost 115 million printed works. In the 18 volumes of the official catalogue compiled after the war, Répertoire des biens culturels spoliés pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale, there are 1,177,291 objects from Soviet museums that have been stolen or destroyed. The record, published by the Russian Lost Art Institute, continues to be updated. Among the documented thefts that have led to later discoveries, the one in the Peterhof Gardens stands out. The Imperial Palace of Peterhof, located 29 kilometers west of Leningrad, was famous for its fountain systems and bronze sculptures. Museum workers, anticipating the occupation, managed to bury many of the statues before the German arrival. Some were moved to St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg for protection. But when Peterhof was liberated in January 1944, several crucial objects did not appear. The statue of Samson, the symbol of the main fountain in the garden, the figure representing the Volkhov River, and other sculptures had disappeared without a trace. In the case of the Tretyakov Gallery, some works appeared decades later. In 2006, one of the painter Alexander Borisov's Nordic landscapes, Vilchiki Hills at Sunset in mid-September 1896, bought at the time by the gallery's founder, Pavel Tretyakov, was found in an antiques market and returned to its place of origin. His absence had lasted 65 years. The works of Nikolai Dubovskoy, Vladimir Makovsky, and Ivan Shishkin, also missing in the first months of the invasion, remain unlocated to date. The room behind the bookshelf, Beccar's collection. On June 8, 2017, in the residential neighborhood of Beccar, 21 kilometers north of Buenos Aires, agents from Interpol and the Argentine Federal Police executed a search warrant on a property on Centenario Avenue. The original operation had a different purpose. It was part of an investigation into trafficking in Chinese cultural objects on UNESCO's Red List, specifically bronze bells from the Tang dynasty, which the Cultural Heritage Protection Division of the Federal Police had been tracking under the codename Operation Near East. The owner of the house was Carlos Alberto Olivares, an antique dealer of respected reputation in the collectors' circles of the north of the Buenos Aires suburbs. Known and well-connected among buyers of historical objects, he did not arouse suspicion. The agents who entered the property went through the rooms without initially finding anything extraordinary. Then they came to a white shelf with no books. One of the agents pushed her. There was a door behind it. The room they found when they crossed it was carefully organized: wooden shelves, glass display cases, objects arranged with the meticulousness of a systematic collector. What they contained left the agents speechless. The Inspector Commissioner of Interpol Argentina, Marcelo Daniel El Jaibe, expressed it directly to the media. It was the largest batch of Third Reich artifacts ever seized in Argentine history. In total, 83 pieces, of which 72 were unique. Subsequent expert reports confirmed that most of them were originals. The list was extraordinary in its variety. Busts of Adolf Hitler in various sizes, bronze and ceramic. A statue of the imperial eagle on a marble pedestal with the swastika engraved on the base, identified with the seal of the Karl Eichhorn Cutlery Factory, a company founded in Solingen in 1865 that had produced steel for the SS throughout the war. an hourglass with the swastika carved into the frame, a Ouija board printed in German, ceremonial knives of different ranks, military medals and decorations with their original cases, partially preserved banners, field binoculars, a harmonica, a box of tobacco with inlays, photographs and negatives of the time, and several toys, children's harmonies, board games, indoctrination figures, designed for the Hitler Youth, which Security Minister Patricia Bullrich publicly described as items to indoctrinate children. The medical instruments were what most disturbed the researchers. Inside elegant, perfectly preserved dark leather cases, several anthropometric measuring devices were found. The most disturbing, a skull-measuring compass engraved with the swastika, identical to the type used in the regime's racial classification programs. Jonathan Carsenbaum, director of the Buenos Aires Holocaust Museum, who was involved in identifying the pieces, said, "The one that struck me the most was the racial skull-measuring object. That instrument belonged to a pseudoscientific system whose most extreme application was carried out by units of the Ahnenerbe, the SS Research Institute, and by camp doctors such as Josef Mengele, who used cranial measurements and comparative physical analyses in his experiments at Auschwitz. There were also magnifying glasses, several in their original cases. One of them was accompanied by something unexpected, a photographic negative. When it was revealed, it showed Adolf Hitler holding an identical magnifying glass. On June 21, 2017, the German newspaper Bild published on its front page the headline, "Hitler's Silver Treasure Found." The researchers showed the image to the media on the condition that it not be reproduced. Whether or not the magnifying glass belonged to the Fura was, technically, impossible to prove without further documentation. But Martin Bardell, current director of the Carl Eichhorn Company, confirmed to Argentine investigators that several of the objects found bore the seal of his company and that it had manufactured specially commissioned models for hierarchies of the regime. When a desire came from a customer, it was a matter of satisfying it. Along with the Nazi relics, the agents found 38 mummies of Egyptian animals and bones of Glyptodont, a prehistoric South American mammal, in the same room, suggesting that Olivares was collecting objects from multiple origins. The mixture of pieces from the Third Reich with antiquities from other cultures and eras led the researchers to evaluate two hypotheses: that the collection had been formed over decades by Olivares himself through the international black market, or that it had been bought en bloc through intermediaries with links to the networks of the German community in Argentina. The dominant hypothesis among researchers and members of the Argentine Jewish community pointed to the latter. Argentina, under the regime of General Juan Domingo Perón, had maintained a position of sympathy for the Axis during the war and had later facilitated the arrival of European war criminals with false documents managed in some cases, with the collaboration of agents of Odessa and certain sectors of the Catholic Church that issued identity documents through the Red Cross. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, lived in Buenos Aires during the 1950s under the assumed name Helmut Gregor before fleeing to Paraguay in 1959. Adolf Eichmann, architect of Holocaust logistics, was kidnapped by Mossad agents in Buenos Aires in May 1960 and executed in Israel in June 1962 after being sentenced to death. He had lived for years in the neighborhood of San Fernando under the name Ricardo Clement, working at the Mercedes-Benz plant in González Catán. The fact that two of the world's most wanted war criminals had lived undetected in the Argentine capital for more than a decade made it plausible that high-ranking personal collections would also arrive in the country. The federal police were unable to get Olivares to confess the origin of the objects. Commissioner El Haibe noted that the antique dealer probably avoids confessing where he got this collection from. He was charged with possession of objects of illegal origin, but remained free under judicial investigation by federal judge Sandra Arroyo Salgado. Charges in Argentina for possession of Nazi material are complex. The anti-discrimination law prohibits the public exhibition of such material if it incites hatred, but private possession is not always directly punishable. In October 2019, the Buenos Aires Holocaust Museum received formal custody of the collection. Marcelo Mindlin, the museum's president, stated at the October 2nd press conference that the objects encouraged hatred, death, and destruction, and would be part of a permanent exhibition in the service of transmitting democratic values, education, and the struggle for memory. The 83 artifacts remained in the museum's custody while the court case continued. Today, they are part of one of the most complete collections of the history of Nazism available in Latin America. The enigma at the bottom of the sea: machines, submarines, and submerged technology. In the fall of 2000, a team of researchers from the Schleswig-Holstein Museum of Technology in Kiel, Germany, began a search expedition in the waters of the Baltic Sea. They were looking for remnants of machinery and military equipment sunk in the last days of the war. Among their equipment were side-scan sonar and depth cameras. What they didn't expect to find was an Enigma machine. The Enigma machine was the most sophisticated encryption device of its time. The M4 naval model, adopted by the Kriegsmarine in 1942, generated such a large number of key combinations that it took Allied experts years to find the method to decipher it. The work of the mathematicians at Bletchley Park, particularly the work of Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, along with the capture of machines and manuals in extreme risk operations, was instrumental in the course of the war. In the final days of the conflict, when it became clear that Germany would not be able to resist, the crews of the Kriegsmarine were ordered to destroy or sink all cryptographic material. Thousands of machines and documents were thrown into the sea, buried or burned. Allied intelligence knew that many enigmas had been destroyed in this way, and that recovering them would be almost impossible. The machine found at the bottom of the Baltic in 2000 was in remarkable condition. The rusty crust of algae and sediment had protected it from oxidation in the months following its sinking. After a meticulous restoration process, the conservators confirmed that it was an M3 model with 3 rotors, functional in its basic mechanisms. It was, at the time, one of approximately 50 complete Enigma machines still known in the world. Today, it is preserved in the Kiel Museum of Technology. In 2013, volunteer divers from the environmental organization NABU found another Enigma machine in the Baltic Sea, near the island of Fehmarn, during an operation to clean up abandoned fishing nets. The machine was entangled in a net 25 meters deep. Subsequent analysis confirmed its authenticity and naval origin. This was precisely the most likely circumstance of its sinking: the crew of a ship or submarine that threw it overboard so that it would not fall into Allied hands in the last days of April or early May 1945. The case of the submarine U-534 is perhaps more dramatic. On May 5, 1945, 3 days before the German capitulation, U-534, a Type 9C/40 submarine, was attacked by a British Liberator aircraft of RAF 86 Squadron at Kattegat, northern Denmark. The submarine sank to a depth of 68 meters. 52 of its 52 crew members survived. 3 died. U-534 remained at the bottom of the sea for 48 years. In 1993, Danish businessman Carsten Ree financed the recovery operation. With a rescue boat and diving equipment, the submarine was lifted from the bottom of the Kattegat and transported to the mainland. What they found inside was a mixture of the everyday and the historical: personal belongings of the crew, classified operational documents, technical equipment from the final period of the war, and, according to sources of the investigators who participated in the extraction, indications of experimental weaponry. U-534 is on display today, sectioned up for inspection, at the Birkenhead Submarine Museum in northwest England. Another submarine discovery of a different order occurred in 1944 off the coast of the island of Vis in Croatia, when an American B-17G bomber of the 97th Bombardment Group was shot down by German anti-aircraft artillery. The aircraft, with several damaged engines, managed to glide a few more kilometers before impacting the water about 50 meters from the Croatian shore. The crew escaped on rafts. The plane sank mostly intact at 70 meters deep. Decades later, when sport divers began exploring the wreck, they found one of the world's best-preserved B-17 submerged. Its engines, fuselage, and parts of its armament remain in almost original position. The site is today a diving destination of some reputation among military history enthusiasts. The silver treasure in the Atlantic, SS Gersopper and SS City of Cairo. On February 16, 1941, at 10 p.m., the British steamship freighter SS Gersopper was sailing alone in the North Atlantic, 300 miles southwest of the coast of Galway, Ireland. It was a 125-metre-long steel-hulled vessel, built in 1919, owned by the British India Steam Navigation Company Limited of London. He had left Calcutta in December 1940 with a cargo of silver ingots, pig iron and tea. She completed the Cape of Good Hope, called at Freetown in Sierra Leone, and joined an Allied convoy bound for Britain under Captain Gerald Highland. The convoy sailed in formation for days, but upon entering the most dangerous waters of the North Atlantic, the Gaiasoppa was left behind. A storm and fuel problems separated him from the main group. He continued alone. A German Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor reconnaissance aircraft located him on the afternoon of the 16th. The signal was transmitted to the submarine U-101, commanded by the Kapitän-Leutnant Ernst Mengersen, which operated in that strip of the Atlantic. The torpedo hit the hull of the Gaiasoppa that same night. The ship sank within minutes. Of the 85 crew, only 6 managed to reach a lifeboat under the command of Second Officer R.H. Ayres. They drifted for 13 days in the North Atlantic in the middle of winter with temperatures below zero and rough seas. 5 died during that journey. Only Ayres made it to the Irish coast. He was the only survivor of the crew. The Gaiasoppa descended to a depth of 4,700 meters. With it fell his silver bullion. According to insurance documents at the time, 7 million troy ounces in total, including more than 3 million ounces of private silver insured by the UK government with a declared value of £600,000 in 1941. The British government paid that sum as compensation to the owners of the cargo, and the ship became formally owned by the Crown. For nearly 70 years, the Gaiasoppa lay at the bottom of the North Atlantic in international waters 480 kilometres off the Irish coast. In 2010, the UK government's Department for Transport launched a public tender for the salvage of the cargo. The winning company was Odyssey Marine Exploration, based in Tampa, Florida, already known for its deep-sea archaeology and recovery operations. The terms of the contract stated that Odyssey would retain 80% of the net value recovered. The United Kingdom would get the remaining 20%. In September 2011, Odyssey's remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, tracked the Atlantic floor in the documented sinking zone. What they found immediately confirmed the identification. The hull of the Gaiasoppa lay at the bottom essentially intact, with the hatches and superstructure still recognizable. At that depth, the currents are minimal. The temperature of the water is around 2 degrees Celsius, and the pressure is approximately 470 atmospheres. Those conditions had preserved the metal with remarkable efficiency. Mining operations began in May 2012 aboard the 88-meter seabed worker. The ROVs made precision cuts in certain areas of the hull to access the cargo compartments without compromising the integrity of the wreck. The work was defined by Odyssey's CEO, Greg Stem, as a surgical removal of precious metals from the ship's safe zones. On July 23, 2012, the company announced the first phase of recovery, 1,203 silver bars, 48 tons in total, equivalent to 1.4 million troy ounces. The ingots were transported to secure facilities in the United Kingdom. The serial numbers engraved on each bar corresponded exactly to the insurance documentation from 1941. In 2013, the second campaign was executed. This time, the ROVs extracted an additional 1,574 ingots, 61 tons more, including areas of the hold that in the first operation had been inaccessible by local currents. By the end of both campaigns, Odyssey had recovered 2,792 silver bars, representing more than 99% of the documented insured cargo. The operation was classified by the company and by the specialized media as the largest recovery of precious metals in deep waters ever carried out. The project was the subject of a 3-episode series on the Discovery Channel under the title Silver Rush. Researchers from the Odyssey team who participated in documenting the wreck also found 700 pieces of postal mail sunk with the ship. Many of the letters, protected by the sealed duffel bags in which they traveled, retained legible ink. They were letters from soldiers in the field, from families separated by the war, from merchants. The project to preserve that correspondence was documented in the book Voices from the Deep, published several years later. The history of the SS City of Cairo has notable points of contact with that of the Gayasopper, but its cargo was different and its depth of rest much greater. The City of Cairo was a Union Castle Line passenger and cargo ship, 8,034 gross tons, which departed Bombay in October 1942, bound for Britain. In its holds, it carried a secret cargo, approximately 100 tons of silver Indian rupee coins sent by the British Indian government to finance the Allied war effort. The value of the cargo at 1942 prices was estimated at several £1 million. On November 6, 1942, the German submarine U-68, commanded by the Korvettenkapitän Karl Friedrich Merten, torpedoed the city of Cairo in the South Atlantic, about 2,600 kilometers from Ascension Island. The attack killed 104 of the 302 passengers and crew. The survivors were distributed in several lifeboats that drifted for weeks across the Atlantic. Only one of them was rescued. The shipwreck of the city of Cairo was one of the deadliest in the South Atlantic. The ship rested for almost 70 years at a depth of more than 5,000 meters, at the limit of the operability of most of the available recovery equipment. In 2011, the same year that Odyssey found the Gayasopper, a team of researchers located the wreck of the city of Cairo. The operations of extracting the silver cargo began in the following years and extended over several seasons. The extreme depth meant that each dive of the ROVs required hours just on the way down and up. Millions of silver coins were mined in successive campaigns. Many of them, when they surfaced after decades of immersion in salt water at that pressure, presented a dark patina, but their reliefs remained perfectly defined. The commercial value of both recoveries, that of the Gayasopper and that of the city of Cairo, was substantial, but the historical and documentary value far exceeded the economic value. Both wrecks are physical testimonies of the submarine warfare that German U-boats fought in the Atlantic between 1939 and 1945. The so-called Tonnageschlacht, the Battle of Tonnage, conceived by Admiral Karl Dönitz as the method of strangling Great Britain economically by systematically sinking its maritime transport. Between 1939 and 1945, German U-boats sank 2,779 Allied merchant ships with a total displacement of 14.1 million tons. The Gayasopper and the city of Cairo are two of those numbers turned into tangible objects, into ingots with serial numbers that can be touched, into letters that can be read. The forgotten weapons, tanks, rifles and arsenals underground. Not all post-war discoveries are paintings or precious metals. Some are downright dangerous. In 2014, in Heikendorf, near Kiel, Germany, police responded to a complaint about a property with suspicious objects. The owner, a 78-year-old collector identified only by his initials as WH, was known in the community as an eccentric aficionado of historical artifacts. Officers who entered the house and began searching the basement found what would take 9 hours to remove with heavy engineering equipment: a World War II Panzer V Panther completely intact, with its 80mm armor and 45 tons of steel. Next to it, a Flak 88 anti-aircraft gun, a naval torpedo, automatic weapons, and several thousand rounds of ammunition. The Panther was one of the most feared tanks of the war. Introduced in 1943 on the Eastern Front after the Battle of Kursk, it had been designed as a response to the Soviet T-34. Owning one was technically illegal in Germany under the War Weapons Control Act. The local prosecutor's office filed charges against the owner. The tank was transferred to a museum, and the arsenal, including the torpedo and shells, required the preventive evacuation of residents of the area during the extraction day. In 2017, during a renovation of the roof of a house in the town of Oberndorf am Neckar in the state of Baden-Württemberg, the owner discovered metal objects hidden inside the walls. The expert's analysis confirmed that these were 3 STG-44 rifles, Sturmgewehr 44, the first assault rifle in history, developed by the C.G. Haenel Company under the technical direction of Hugo Schmeisser and adopted by the Wehrmacht in 1944. The STG-44 had been hidden in those walls for more than 70 years. The weapon, which directly influenced the design of the AK-47 and M16, was searched for decades by collectors and museums. The 3 specimens found in Oberndorf were in a remarkable state of preservation. In Poland, a country that was one of the most devastated scenes of the entire war, the discovery of Nazi arsenals is a constant. In 2019, in a former military fort near Poznan, maintenance workers opened a sealed section in 1945. Inside, they found a wooden box with 18 Walter P.38 pistols in their original packaging, with preservation grease still present in the mechanisms. The Wieliczka mine, the famous World Heritage Salt City, has areas not yet fully explored where the Germans are suspected of stockpiling equipment when they retreated. The tradition of finding World War II material in Poland is not just a matter of organized archaeological search. Ordinary citizens regularly encounter shells, grenades, and mines during agricultural or construction work. In Egypt's western desert, in the areas near the Battle of El Alamein, it is estimated that more than 25 million explosive devices have been neutralized in demining operations during the decades since the war. Cleanup operations continue today. Operation Flight of the Eagle, the Nazi gold that escaped. On the night of 9th to 10th August 1944, an official car with the registration of the General Staff crossed the Rhine Bridge in Strasbourg. The passenger was SS Obergruppenführer Scheid, who also held the civil title of doctor and headed the industrial company Hermerdorf and Schoenberg Company. His destination was the Hotel Maison Rouge in the heart of the Alsatian city. There, in a reserved room, some of the most powerful men in the German economy were waiting, representatives of Volkswagen, Krupp, Messerschmitt, Röchling, and the chemical company IG Farben, among others. Scheid presided over the meeting on behalf of Reichsleiter Martin Bormann, who was not physically present but who had sent precise instructions. The steps that will be taken as a result of this meeting will determine the future of Germany after the war. Scheid's speech was direct. The war could not be won militarily. The Reich had to plan for its economic continuity. German companies were to immediately begin transferring assets, capital, patents, intellectual property, technology to neutral countries and to South America, so that when the regime fell, Germany's economic infrastructure would survive intact under corporate structures that the Allies could not directly confiscate. Dr. Bosser, who took the minutes of the meeting, wrote, "After the defeat of Germany, the Nazi Party recognizes that certain of its best-known leaders will be condemned as war criminals. However, in cooperation with the industrialists, it is arranging for the placement of its most important but less conspicuous members in various German factories as technical experts or members of its research and design bureaus." The report of that meeting came to the OSS, the US Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA, through a double agent in Strasbourg. It was catalogued, archived, and partially declassified in the following decades. Researcher Jim Keith, in his analysis of OSS files published in the 1990s, quoted the agency's 1945 internal summary. Members of the Nazi Party, German industrialists, and the German military, recognizing that their victory can no longer be achieved, are developing post-war commercial projects trying to renew and cement friendships in foreign business circles and planning the renewal of pre-war cartel agreements. Bormann executed the plan with the meticulousness that characterized him. Nicknamed by his aides the Brown Eminence for his ability to operate without public visibility, he had managed Hitler's personal finances and the Adolf Hitler Fund for German industry, a system of voluntary contributions from businessmen that he redistributed as gratuities to party leaders throughout the war. It had contacts at all levels of the European financial system, access to Swiss banking networks, and direct relations with the international subsidiaries of the largest German industrial conglomerates. The operation established 750 shell companies in Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, and Argentina. The mechanism was simple but effective. The shares of these companies were issued as bearer securities without identity registration. Whoever physically owned the majority shares controlled the company. There was no way to track down the actual owners. Hermann Schmitz, director of IG Farben and former president of the Chase National Bank of New York, where he had been president for 7 years before the war, coordinated the linking of the new front companies with the network of international subsidiaries that Farben maintained in dozens of countries. In his statement to investigators in Nuremberg, Schmitz described in detail how each Farben regional representative abroad had contributed to establishing the 750 new companies that Bormann had ordered to be created. The banking connections that sustained this entire system had roots dating back to the 1930s. By 1936, the Rockefeller family and the J. Henry Schroeder Bank of New York had jointly formed Schroeder, Rockefeller and Company, which provided financial support to the Rome-Berlin axis during the pre-war years. One of the directors was Kurt von Schroeder of the Bank for International Settlements in Cologne, who was also involved in Gestapo activities. Standard Oil of New Jersey, ESCO, changed the registration of its tanker fleet to Panama and continued to sell fuel to fascist Spain, which transferred it to Hamburg. The American International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, ITT, maintained business relations with Germany even after the United States' entry into the war in December 1941, selling artillery fuses through its German subsidiary. Its president for Germany, Gerhard Westrick, was, according to journalist Jim Mars, a close associate of John Foster Dulles, who would later become U.S. Secretary of State during Eisenhower's presidency. These corporate ties were exactly the kind of infrastructure Bormann needed to run Operation Eagle Flight. The Nazi capital that left Europe did not reach the vacuum. It found business structures already operational, banking networks with decades of history and people in positions of influence who had their own reasons to facilitate the transaction. OSS documents declassified between 1989 and 1997, after the US Congress passed the Nazi War Crimes and Holocaust Records Disclosure Act in 1997, revealed details about these connections that had remained classified for decades. The physical route of capital took different forms. Gold bullion and coins traveled in diplomatic suitcases and in hidden compartments of official vehicles to Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal. Industrial patents in chemistry, electronics, pharmaceuticals, and armaments were transferred on paper to subsidiaries in neutral countries. Specialized technicians received false documentation or from refugees and began to cross the borders into Spain and from there to South America, mainly Argentina and Brazil. Martin Bormann, according to journalist Paul Manning in his book Bormann, Nazi in Exile, published in 1982 and based in part on FBI sources, coordinated this flow from his own hideout in the final weeks of the war through a mail system traveling to Sweden, from where coded information was transmitted by high-frequency radio to reception points in Switzerland, Spain, and Argentina. Bormann's ultimate fate was, as noted, death in the early days of May 1945, confirmed by DNA analysis in 1998, but the organization he built continued to function without him. Paul Manning, who accessed part of the FBI files on the case, described the structure Bormann had left behind as the most important accumulation of monetary power under a single check in the history of the world, citing an anonymous banker interviewed for the book. The claim is exaggerated in its proportions, but reflects the real scale of what was documented. The escape route of war criminals, the so-called rat lines, was the human complement of this financial system. Odessa, Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, organization of former SS members, provided false identity documents and secure passages for SS officers and regime leaders who needed to leave Europe. Some of those routes passed through Italy, where monasteries and church officials provided documents from the International Red Cross, which in the post-war chaos issued refugee identity cards without requiring extensive verification. From Italy, the fugitives crossed into Spain or Portugal and from there embarked for Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, or Brazil. Argentina was the favorite destination. President Juan Domingo Perón had maintained a position of neutrality during the war that in practice was close to sympathy for the Axis. His government facilitated the arrival of German technicians and specialists who, according to the official narrative, were professionals hired for the industrial development of the country. In reality, many of them were people with pasts they couldn't reveal. The German community in Argentina, with tens of thousands of members in cities such as Buenos Aires, Córdoba, Bariloche, and Villa General Belgrano, provided a social environment where it was possible to live without attracting attention for decades. The question that remains open is not whether Nazi money escaped from Europe. That is documented. The question is how much of that capital is still operating today, decades later, within international corporate structures whose bearer securities never registered the name of their original owners. The declassified files answer a part of the story. The other part, according to the Volcker Committee and the researchers who worked with its conclusions, may never be fully reconstructed. Project Paperclip, when discovery was technological. Not all post-war discoveries were buried or sunken physical objects. The most lucrative of all was invisible. It was in the archives, in the laboratories, and in the minds of the scientists of the Third Reich. In September 1946, President Harry Truman formally authorized Project Paperclip, a secret program designed to move selected German scientists to the United States. The formal condition of admission was that the candidates had not been active members of the Nazi Party or demonstrated explicit loyalty to Hitler. The reality was different. The Joint Intelligence Targeting Agency, J10A, conducted background investigations on the candidates and found that virtually all of them had been enthusiastic Nazis. The decision made, recorded in partially declassified classified documents between 1989 and 1997, was that sending them back to Germany would likely result in their knowledge being harnessed by the Soviet Union, posing a greater threat to American security than any Nazi sympathies they might harbor. It was ordered that the candidates' files be purged of Nazi references. By 1955, more than 760 German scientists had obtained US citizenship under Project Paperclip, unbeknownst to President Truman. The best known of these was SS Sturmbannführer Werner Magnus Maximilian von Braun, 33 years old when he arrived in the United States. He had been technical director of the Rocket Research Center in Peenemünde, the complex located on the Baltic coast where the A-4 missile, known operationally as V-2, was developed. The V-2 was a liquid-fueled rocket capable of reaching altitudes of 88 kilometers and speeds in excess of 5,700 kilometers per hour, with an operational range of approximately 320 kilometers. Between September 1944 and March 1945, more than 3,170 V-2s were launched against Allied targets, mainly London and Antwerp. In the United States, von Braun first worked for the military on the development of ballistic missiles. He then founded the agency that would become NASA. In 1969, the Saturn V rocket that took man to the moon was a direct product of his work. It is perhaps the clearest case in history in which post-war discoveries had consequences that transformed entire civilizations. The Soviets conducted their own version of the paperclip called Operation Osoaviakim. In October 1946, Soviet intelligence compulsively transferred more than 2,500 German specialists to the Soviet Union, along with their families and equipment, in an operation carried out in a single night. Among them were aeronautical engineers, fuel experts, and nuclear physicists. Helmut Gröttrup, one of von Braun's closest aides in Peenemünde, ended up working for the Soviet missile program that would later give rise to Soyuz rockets. In the files that the Allies captured in German laboratories, they also found the plans of the BMW 003 jet engine, the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter aircraft in history, the HE-162, and dozens of other prototypes. In the workshops of Nordhausen in Thuringia, American troops found underground facilities where concentration camp prisoners, mainly from the Mittelbau-Dora camp, had been forced to manufacture V-2s in working conditions that resulted in the deaths of approximately 20,000 people. The underground factory, dug into Kohnstein Mountain, had two main tunnels, 1.8 kilometers long, and 43 transverse tunnels. It contained the most sophisticated assembly line the American military had ever seen. The Arctic season and the limits of the world. For decades, the existence of a secret Nazi weather station on the island of Alexandra Land in the Franz Josef Land archipelago was considered little more than a footnote in the history of the war. The island, part of the Russian archipelago in the Arctic, is located approximately 900 kilometers from the North Pole. In 1943, the Germans needed it. The Kriegsmarine's operations in the North Atlantic and Arctic depended on accurate weather data. Pressure fronts, winds, and visibility conditions were decisive for submarine attacks and for aviation. Conventional weather stations in Europe were under Allied control. and weather espionage became one of the least known but most vital side conflicts of the war. In August 1943, the German submarine U-255 transported the Schatzgräber station team, treasure hunter, to the island of Alexandra Land, 10 men under the command of Wilhelm Gogh, a meteorologist and SS officer. The team landed with technical equipment, weapons, provisions for several months, and everything necessary to establish a permanent installation. For months, they transmitted coded weather data that came directly to naval and air operations planning centers in Norway and Germany. In August 1944, the team was evacuated. The station was sealed. In 2016, a Russian scientific expedition arrived on the island of Alexandra Land and discovered the remains of the Schatzgräber station. The Arctic permafrost had preserved the materials with extraordinary fidelity. Investigators found approximately 500 artifacts, ammunition, measuring instruments, radio equipment, kitchen utensils, bottles of oil and preserves, documents and personal belongings of the crew. The region's extreme temperatures, which reach -25 degrees Celsius even in summer, had prevented organic materials from decomposing completely. It was a time capsule of the most destructive conflict in history, intact 900 kilometers from the North Pole. The art that came back, collections recovered from the black market. The story of restitution of art stolen by the Nazis did not end in 1945, 1950 or 1970. Continue today. In 2012, German customs conducted a search of Cornelius Görlitz's apartment in Munich's Schwabing neighborhood as part of a tax evasion investigation. In the apartment of an 80-year-old man who lived in absolute isolation, the agents found 1,280 works of art stacked on the walls, some deteriorated by storage conditions. The formal registration of the collection revealed paintings by Picasso, Matisse, Chagall, Beckmann, and dozens of other artists. Many of the works had been confiscated by the Nazi regime from their rightful Jewish owners between 1933 and 1945 as part of the systematic looting of the Action Entartete Kunst, the program of confiscation of degenerate art, and the general policy of expropriation of Jewish property. Cornelius's father, Hildebrand Görlitz, had been one of the art dealers officially authorized by the Reich to liquidate confiscated collections. He had 4 authorized dealers in all. Görlitz was one of them. Some works he sold abroad, others he kept for himself. The collection passed to his son at the end of the war, and he lived for decades from the discreet sale of pieces on the international market. The scandal unleashed by the Munich discovery accelerated international efforts to systematize the identification of works of Nazi origin. The London-based Art Loss Register database has recorded more than 700,000 works of art that disappeared during World War II. It is estimated that between 10 and 20% of the works currently circulating in the high-end art market have gaps in their ownership history that coincide with the period 1933 to 1945. In Argentina, the painting described in post-war documents as Portrait of a Lady, an 18th-century painting stolen from a collector during the Nazi occupation, was accidentally located in 2017 when a researcher noticed its image in the photo catalogue included in a real estate advertisement. The photograph showed the interior of the home of a former Nazi officer who had settled in Argentina after the war. The painting, which had spent decades hanging on the wall of a private residence in Buenos Aires, was identified, removed by Argentine authorities and returned to the heirs of its original owner. Every year, the Commission for Nazi Plunder and the various national restitution agencies process dozens of claims. Most involve works that have been in public museums for decades or in private collections of people who acquired them in good faith. The process inevitably generates legal conflicts that can last for years. The 1998 Washington Declaration, signed by 44 countries, established the basic principles that should guide such restitutions. But the actual application of those principles varies greatly from country to country and from case to case. The total value of works of art stolen by the Nazis that have not yet been recovered or returned is impossible to calculate precisely. The most cited estimates speak of between 100,000 and 650,000 works. If a conservative average value is adopted, the total figure could be in the hundreds of billions of dollars in today's market. What is still sleeping? Under the waters of the Rhine, off Koblenz in 2011, workers working on the riverbed during a dry season that left the river partially dry discovered a 1,800-kilogram British aerial bomb. They had not been able to detonate it in a controlled manner on the spot. 45,000 people had to be evacuated from the surrounding area of the city before it could be neutralized. It was the most tangible reminder that the war is not entirely gone, it is simply waiting. Every year, German authorities neutralize between 2,000 and 5,000 unexploded ordnance inherited from World War II. In Poland, Belgium, France, the Netherlands and the Baltic countries, the figures are equivalent or higher. European soil remains, in a literal sense, the largest archive in the history of the conflict. Weeds in Belgium's Ardennes forest grow among the wreckage of 500 American vehicles abandoned in 1945 because transporting them back across the ocean was more expensive than leaving them there. Pacific currents have rusted the hulls of landing craft that sank off Saipan and Guadalcanal. In Lake Kais, Norway, divers have found German weaponry that troops threw into the water during the 1945 retreat. In the tunnels of the island of Alderney in the English Channel, part of the bunker system built with forced labor remains not fully explored. The archives, moreover, continue to be opened. In 1997, the US Congress passed the Holocaust and Nazi War Crimes Records Disclosure Act, which mandated the progressive declassification of millions of documents from the OSS, the State Department, and other agencies. Many of those documents reveal connections between Nazi capital, Swiss banks, industrial corporations, and post-war intelligence services that have yet to be fully investigated. The American historian Greg Bradshaw of the National Archives of the United States, who published in 1999 the definitive study on the Murkers treasure, put it precisely: the total restitution of what was stolen by Nazism has not been achieved and probably never will be. Not because objects don't exist, but because time, war, and the silence of the guilty have erased too many traces. What the Third Reich left behind in its fall was a puzzle whose pieces are scattered all over the ocean floor, all the mines in Central Europe, all the antiquities markets in the world, all the museum deposits that still hold objects with gaps in their history. Each new piece that appears recomposes the picture a little more than it was, and each one remembers, with brutal precision, the price of what happened.